The Cold Awakening. Dr. Mira Iland stood alone in the dimly lit laboratory, her reflection barely visible in the frosted glass of the cryotube before her. The room hummed softly with the sound of machines keeping the air cool and sterile. The faint blue glow from the monitors cast long shadows across the walls, adding to the eerie stillness. Inside the cryotube lay the body of Lieutenant Jared Cross, perfectly preserved as though he had simply fallen asleep. His face, pale and lifeless, showed no signs of the terrifying experiments he had endured decades ago. Mira's heart raced as she stared at him, her fingers trembling over the controls. She had revived countless test subjects before, but this was different. Jared wasn't just another experiment. He was a forgotten piece of history. The government had approached Mira with an offer she couldn't refuse, a fully funded project to bring Jared back to life. Officially, it was a groundbreaking attempt to push the boundaries of science. Unofficially, Mira suspected there were secrets buried too deep for her to uncover yet. Still, she had accepted the challenge, driven by equal parts curiosity and ambition. Mira took a deep breath and activated the reanimation sequence. The cryotube hissed as steam poured out, releasing decades of cold air trapped inside. The monitors flashed to life, displaying Jared's vitals, or lack thereof. His heart had been modified in ways Mira barely understood, and now it lay completely still, defying her efforts. "Come on," she muttered under her breath, adjusting the controls. A low hum filled the room as electrical pulses coursed through Jared's body, attempting to kickstart the lifeless heart. The monitor beeped rhythmically, but the flatline remained stubbornly unbroken. Hours passed, and Mira felt her hopes slipping away. She leaned against the lab counter, rubbing her temples in frustration. "Why won't it work?" she whispered to herself. The files on Project Lazarus hinted at incredible advancements, but they also spoke of horrors too grim to comprehend fully. Jared had volunteered for this, but the details of his final moments were redacted, hidden behind layers of classified data. Just as she was about to give up for the night, the lights in the lab flickered. Mira froze, her eyes darting to the main console. A strange distortion rippled across the monitor, and static filled the room. For a moment, she thought she heard a faint whisper, a voice calling her name. Dr. Iland. Her heart skipped a beat. She spun around, scanning the empty lab, but there was no one there. She tried to steady her breathing, convincing herself it was just her imagination. Stress could do that, right? The monitor crackled again, this time displaying a brief spike in activity. Mira's eyes widened as she saw a flicker of movement within the cryotube. She rushed to the controls, her fingers flying over the keyboard. Jared's finger twitched, ever so slightly, and then his eyes shot open. Mira staggered back, her hand flying to her mouth. His eyes glowed faintly blue, an unnatural light that sent shivers down her spine. Jared blinked slowly, his expression blank and unreadable. The monitor beeped erratically as his heart emitted strange pulses, irregular yet undeniably active. "Lieutenant Cross," Mira said cautiously, stepping closer. Her voice trembled despite her attempt to stay calm. "Can you hear me?" Jared's gaze shifted toward her, and for a moment, it seemed as though he recognized her. Then his body convulsed violently, his back arching as if an unseen force was pulling at him. The glow in his eyes intensified, and the lab equipment around him sparked and flickered. Mira darted to the console, trying to stabilize his vitals, but the readings made no sense. His heart wasn't beating like a normal human's. Instead, it was generating bursts of energy that disrupted the machines. She typed frantically, attempting to override the system, when Jared suddenly went still. "Jared," she called out, her voice breaking. She hesitated before approaching the cryotube, afraid of what she might find. But as she peered inside, she saw his chest rising and falling in shallow breaths. He was alive. Against all odds, he was alive. Before she could process the miracle before her, the lab lights dimmed again. A loud clang echoed from somewhere in the facility, followed by the unmistakable sound of heavy footsteps. Mira's stomach churned as dread washed over her. Someone, or something, was approaching. She glanced back at Jared, who remained unconscious but alive. Grabbing a small handheld device from the counter, Mira braced herself. Whoever was coming, they wouldn't take her discovery without a fight. The footsteps grew louder, and the lab door hissed as it began to open. Jared's return. Jared Cross opened his eyes to a world he didn't recognize. Everything felt wrong. The air was heavy, the lights too bright, and the sterile smell of the room made his stomach churn. He sat up with a start, his muscles tense, ready for a fight, but his body didn't respond the way he expected. A dull ache spread through his chest, and his hands trembled as if they weren't his own. Dr. Mira Ilan froze mid-step as she saw Jared move. He was awake, his glowing blue eyes scanning the room like a cornered animal. Slowly, she approached him, her hands raised to show she wasn't a threat. "Lieutenant Cross," she said softly, her voice calm but laced with caution. "You're safe. You're in my lab. Do you know where you are?" Jared stared at her, his breath coming in shallow gasps. He opened his mouth to speak, but the words wouldn't come. Images flashed in his mind, faces he couldn't name, a bright light, searing pain, and the sound of someone screaming. Was it him? He wasn't sure. "Whoa!" His voice cracked, dry and hoarse, like it hadn't been used in years. "Who are you?" "I'm Dr. Mira Ilan," she said, taking a careful step closer. I brought you back." Her words hung in the air, heavy and surreal. Jared frowned, his glowing eyes narrowing. "Brought me back? From where?" Mira hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "You died, Jared. Decades ago. You were part of an experiment, something called Project Lazarus. They froze you, preserved your body. And now, I revived you." Jared's expression hardened, as if he were processing her words and finding them impossible to believe. "Dead? No, that's not." He clutched his chest suddenly, his fingers gripping the fabric of his shirt. A strange pulse ran through his body, like an electric current, making him wince. What did you do to me?" he growled, his voice trembling with a mix of anger and fear. "Your heart," Mira explained quickly. "It was replaced during the experiments. It's not a normal heart. It's—" She stopped, unsure if he was ready to hear the truth. "It's different." Jared's glowing blue eyes flicked down to his chest. He pulled the shirt aside to see a faint blue light pulsing beneath his skin. His breath caught in his throat. "What the hell is this?" His voice rose, panic creeping in. "I don't have all the answers yet," Mira admitted, her tone honest but urgent. "I just know they did something to you. Something inhuman. But you're alive now. That's what matters." "Alive?" Jared barked a bitter laugh, shaking his head. "This doesn't feel like living." Before Mira could respond, Jared's head snapped toward the far corner of the room. His senses sharpened, and his body tensed, as if he were hearing something she couldn't. "Do you hear that?" he asked, his voice low and wary. "Hear what?" Mira replied, confusion flickering across her face. A deep hum filled the air, faint but growing louder. Jared's glowing eyes widened, and he swung his legs off the cryo table, standing unsteadily. "We're not alone," he muttered. Mira's stomach dropped. She had dismissed the earlier footsteps and glitches in the lab as paranoia, but Jared's reaction made her blood run cold. "What are you talking about?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Something's wrong," Jared said, his gaze fixed on the sealed lab doors. "They're here." "Who's here?" Mira demanded, her panic rising. But Jared didn't answer. Instead, he staggered forward, gripping the edge of the counter for support. His movements were unsteady, as if his body was still adjusting to being alive again. The lights flickered, and a loud mechanical hiss echoed through the lab. Mira's heart raced as she grabbed Jared's arm, pulling him toward a console. "Stay behind me," she ordered, though she wasn't sure what she could do against whoever, or whatever, was coming. Jared shook his head, a flicker of determination in his glowing eyes. No, if they're here for me, I'm not hiding. The doors hissed open, revealing a team of Black Ops soldiers clad in sleek, high-tech armor. Their faces were obscured by helmets, and their weapons were aimed directly at Jared. "Target acquired," one of them said, his voice distorted through a modulator. Mira stepped in front of Jared instinctively, raising her hands. "He's not a threat. He just woke up. You can't take him." "Step aside, Doctor," the soldier commanded, his tone cold and unwavering. "This isn't your concern." Jared's chest glowed brighter, and he took a step forward, his strength returning. "You want me? Come and get me," he snarled. Before Mira could stop him, a burst of energy erupted from Jared's chest, sending a shockwave through the room. The soldiers staggered back, their weapons short-circuiting. Sparks flew, and alarms blared as the lab descended into chaos. Jared collapsed to his knees, clutching his chest as the glow dimmed. Mira rushed to his side, her heart pounding. "What was that?" she whispered, fear and awe in her voice. "I don't know," Jared rasped, his breath uneven. "But I think they put a weapon inside me." The soldiers regrouped, their weapons recalibrating as they prepared to strike again. Mira grabbed Jared's arm, her mind racing. "We need to get out of here. Now." With no time to think, Mira led Jared toward the emergency exit, her thoughts a whirlwind of fear and questions. Who were these soldiers? What did they want with Jared? And most of all, what had Project Lazarus turned him into? Secrets of Project Lazarus. The night was cold and silent, except for the faint hum of Mira's underground escape tunnel. She led Jared down the narrow, dimly lit passageway, her heart pounding with fear and adrenaline. His footsteps were heavy, uneven, as though he was struggling to stay upright. The faint blue glow in his chest flickered like a dying flame. Jared leaned against the wall, gasping for breath. "How far?" he managed, his voice strained. "Not much farther," Mira said, glancing over her shoulder. Her face was pale, her mind racing. The attack in the lab had shaken her, but Jared's strange abilities terrified her even more. "We have a safe house about a mile from here. You just have to hold on." Jared pushed himself forward, his jaw tight with determination. "I didn't wake up to die again," he muttered. But the glow in his chest dimmed further, and his legs buckled. Mira caught him just in time, pulling him upright. "Hey, stay with me," she urged, her tone a mix of fear and resolve. "I didn't bring you back just to lose you now." Jared forced a weak smile, but his eyes were distant. "You shouldn't have brought me back at all." They reached the safe house, a forgotten bunker buried beneath layers of concrete and secrecy. Mira keyed in the access code, the heavy metal door groaning open. She guided Jared inside and lowered him onto a makeshift bed, her hands trembling as she checked his vitals. His pulse was erratic, and the energy readings from his heart were dangerously unstable. "I need to stabilize you," Mira said, rummaging through her medical kit. Her voice shook, but she forced herself to stay focused. "If I don't, whatever they did to you, it's going to kill you." Jared's hand shot out, gripping her wrist with surprising strength. "Don't waste your time on me," he said, his glowing eyes locking onto hers. "I need answers. Who were those men? Why did they come for me?" Mira hesitated, her chest tightening. She had been avoiding the truth, hoping to buy time until Jared was stable. But his piercing gaze demanded answers. Slowly, she pulled out a tablet and tapped into her encrypted files. "I found this in the old Project Lazarus archives," she said, turning the screen toward Jared. The tablet displayed classified documents, filled with redacted text and grainy photos. "You weren't just part of some experiment, Jared. You were the experiment." Jared's brow furrowed as he stared at the screen. The documents described an initiative to create the perfect super soldier, enhanced strength, endurance, and a heart capable of generating energy far beyond human limits. But the notes in the margins told a darker story. Subjects who went insane, bodies that rejected the modifications, and cover-ups that left no trace of the failures. They didn't just enhance you, Mira continued, her voice low. They turned your heart into a weapon. It doesn't pump blood like a normal heart. It generates energy. That's how you were able to take down those soldiers. But it's unstable. If we don't fix it, it'll kill you. Jared sat in silence, his jaw clenched. Memories began to surface, sharp and fragmented. Faces he couldn't place. Voices shouting orders. The searing pain in his chest as they upgraded him. And one face stood out, a man with cold, calculating eyes. Voss, Jared whispered, the name rolling off his tongue like venom. Mira froze. Who? Captain Voss, Jared said, his voice hardening. He was the one running Project Lazarus. He said he'd make us unstoppable. But something went wrong. I remember him standing over me, watching me die. Mira's stomach churned. She had read Voss's name in the files but hadn't connected it to Jared's memories. If Voss is behind this, he might still be alive, she said. And if he's the one who sent those soldiers, he's after you. Jared's fists clenched, the faint glow in his chest brightening for a moment. Then we find him, he said, his voice steady despite the pain in his eyes. I'm not running anymore. Before Mira could respond, an alert flashed on her tablet. A surveillance drone had picked up their location. The screen showed a live feed of Black Ops soldiers closing in on the safe house, their weapons drawn. We don't have time for this, Mira said, her voice rising. She grabbed a small device from her kit and jabbed it into Jared's arm. He winced as the serum flowed into his veins, temporarily stabilizing his energy levels. What was that? Jared asked, his voice sharp. Something to keep you alive, Mira said, grabbing her bag. But it won't last long. We have to move. Now. Jared pushed himself to his feet, his movements steadier but still strained. Let them come, he said, his voice cold. If Voss wants me, I'll make sure he regrets it. Mira shook her head, her heart pounding. This isn't a fight we can win. Not yet. As the pounding of boots echoed above them, Jared and Mira exchanged a determined look. The storm was coming, and they both knew there was no turning back. The heart of betrayal. The safe house was silent, except for the faint hum of a broken generator in the corner. Jared sat on the edge of a battered metal cot, his head bowed, his hands clutching the faintly glowing spot in his chest. Mira watched him from across the room, her fingers tapping nervously on the desk. The room smelled of old metal and damp earth, but neither of them seemed to notice. How long are you going to keep staring? Jared's voice was hoarse, his tone sharp. He didn't look up. Mira flinched but didn't look away. I'm trying to figure out what's happening to you. That thing in your chest isn't just a heart, Jared. It's something else. Jared chuckled bitterly. Yeah, I figured that much when I blasted a squad of soldiers into the wall without trying. Mira opened her mouth to respond but stopped when Jared raised his head. His glowing blue eyes were dimmer now, but they still burned with anger. And something deeper. Pain. You brought me back to life, Jared said, his voice steady but cold. But you don't know what they did to me, do you? You don't know what I became. Mira hesitated, her hands curling into fists. I know enough, she said softly. I know they didn't just change your body. They turned you into a weapon. And if we don't stop them, they'll do it again. To someone else. Jared scoffed. So I'm supposed to be your lab rat? A walking, talking science project? No, Mira said firmly, standing up. You're supposed to be a soldier. A fighter. Isn't that what you were before all this? Jared's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. The silence stretched between them, heavy and uncomfortable. Then, without warning, Jared stood, his movements stiff but determined. He walked to the desk, towering over Mira. I remember him, Jared said, his voice low. Voss. He was my captain. He told us we'd be heroes, that we'd save lives. But it was all a lie. He didn't care about us. He just wanted his experiment to work. Mira's heart sank. She had read about Voss in the files, his ruthless ambition, his obsession with creating the perfect soldier. But hearing it from Jared made it real. Personal. Jared, Mira said carefully, if Voss is still alive, we need to find him. He's the only one who knows how to fix what's happening to you. Jared shook his head, his fists clenching. Fix it. There's no fixing this. I'm not a man anymore. I'm a machine. A broken one. You're wrong, Mira said, her voice rising. You're more human than anyone I've ever met. You fought to survive, even when everything was taken from you. That's not a machine. That's humanity. Jared stared at her, his expression unreadable. Then he looked away, his shoulders sagging. Maybe you're right, he muttered. But if we're going after Voss, we're doing it my way. Mira nodded, relief flooding her chest. Then let's start by finding him. She turned back to her computer, pulling up the files she had stolen from the government database. As she scrolled through the data, her eyes widened. Jared, she said, her voice trembling. There's something you need to see. Jared moved closer, his glowing eyes narrowing as he read the screen. It was a list of the original Project Lazarus candidates. His name was there, along with a dozen others. But only one name was marked as active. Voss, Jared growled, his voice filled with venom. That's not all, Mira said, scrolling further. She stopped on a set of blueprints, schematics for a machine powered by something called the Lazarus Core. This is what they were working on, she said, her fingers tracing the lines on the screen. Your heart. It's a prototype. But they've made more. A lot more. Jared's chest burned as he stared at the blueprints. Memories surfaced, sharp and painful. He saw the machine, felt its pull, heard Voss's voice whispering promises of power and immortality. They're not just making soldiers, he said quietly. They're making slaves. Before Mira could respond, the safe house lights flickered, and a sharp beep sounded from her tablet. A surveillance drone had locked onto their location. Mira's heart sank as she saw the live feed. Dozens of soldiers were closing in, their weapons glowing with the same eerie blue energy as Jared's chest. We've been found, Mira said, her voice barely above a whisper. Jared grabbed a rifle from the safe house wall, his movements quick and fluid. Then let's give them a reason to regret it. Wait, Mira said, grabbing his arm. If you use that power again, it could kill you. Jared's glowing eyes locked onto hers. If we don't stop them, they'll do this to someone else. I'm not letting that happen. The pounding of boots echoed above them, growing louder. Mira swallowed hard, her mind racing. She had brought Jared back to life to save him. But now it felt like he was the one saving her. As the first explosion rocked the safe house, Jared stepped forward, his glowing chest flaring to life. Let's end this, he said, his voice steady. Once and for all. The battle for humanity. The desert stretched endlessly under the pale light of a dying moon. The air was still, heavy with an eerie silence that made every sound feel amplified. Mira crouched behind a rusted cargo container, her heart pounding in her chest. Beside her, Jared knelt, his glowing blue eyes scanning the horizon. The faint hum of drones echoed in the distance, growing louder with each passing second. This is suicide, Mira whispered, gripping the small transmitter in her hand. You can barely stand, and we're walking straight into their fortress. Jared didn't look at her. His gaze was fixed on the towering facility ahead, a cold, metallic monstrosity surrounded by armed guards and automated turrets. The Lazarus facility. The place where it all began. They're not expecting us to come to them, Jared said, his voice calm but edged with steel. That's our advantage. Mira shook her head. An advantage isn't worth much when you're outnumbered and outgunned. Jared turned to her then, his face pale but determined. "I'm not here to win a fight," he said. "I'm here to end this. For good." Mira swallowed hard, her chest tightening. She wanted to argue, to tell him they could find another way. But the look in his eyes stopped her. He wasn't just determined, he was resolved. This was his fight, and he was ready to see it through, no matter the cost. "Fine," she said, her voice shaky. "But if you go down, I'm not leaving you behind." Jared allowed himself a small smile. "You always did have a stubborn streak." The sound of approaching footsteps snapped them back to the moment. Mira peeked around the corner of the container, her breath catching as she spotted a patrol of soldiers sweeping the perimeter. Their armor gleamed in the moonlight, and their weapons hummed with the same blue energy that coursed through Jared's heart. "They're getting closer," Mira whispered, her fingers tightening around the transmitter. "Let them," Jared said, rising to his feet. The faint glow in his chest flared brighter, illuminating his face. "It's time they learned what they created." Before Mira could stop him, Jared stepped out of cover, his movements slow but deliberate. The soldiers froze, their weapons snapping up to aim at him. "Target identified," one of them said, his voice cold and mechanical. "Engage." The first shot rang out, a bolt of energy streaking toward Jared. He didn't flinch. Instead, the glow in his chest pulsed, and the bolt dissipated midair, as if it had hit an invisible barrier. Jared raised his hands, and a shockwave erupted from his body, sending the soldiers flying. The ground trembled beneath Mira's feet as she watched, stunned. Jared stood tall, his eyes glowing brighter now, his every movement radiating power. But she also saw the strain it was putting on him. His breathing was labored, and sweat dripped down his face. Whatever energy he was using, it was taking a toll. "Jared," Mira shouted, running to his side. "You can't keep this up. You're going to burn out." Jared didn't respond. His focus was locked on the facility ahead, where alarms were blaring and reinforcements were pouring out. "Go," he said, his voice barely audible over the chaos. "Get inside. Find the core. Destroy it." "What about you?" Mira demanded, grabbing his arm. "I'll hold them off," Jared said, his glowing eyes meeting hers. "This is what I'm here for." Mira hesitated, her heart aching. She wanted to argue, to tell him there was another way, but the truth was, she didn't know if there was. So instead, she nodded, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "Don't you dare die on me," she said. Jared smirked, his glow flickering. "No promises." Mira turned and ran, her feet pounding against the dusty ground as she made her way to the facility's entrance. Behind her, she heard the sounds of battle. Blasts of energy, shouts, and the unmistakable roar of Jared's power unleashed. She didn't look back. She couldn't. The facility's doors slid open as she approached, and Mira slipped inside, her heart racing. The interior was cold and sterile, a maze of metal corridors and blinding fluorescent lights. She moved quickly, her mind focused on the mission. The Lazarus Core, the source of everything. Her tablet beeped, guiding her toward the central chamber. As she navigated the labyrinth, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. Shadows flickered at the edges of her vision, and the air felt heavy, oppressive. Finally, she reached the core chamber. The door hissed open, revealing a massive machine at the center of the room. It pulsed with the same blue energy as Jared's heart, its glow casting eerie shadows on the walls. Mira's hands shook as she approached the console. The controls were complex, but she had studied the schematics. She could shut it down, but it would take time. Time Jared might not have. As she worked, her thoughts drifted to him, to the man who had been dragged back to life, only to find himself at the center of a nightmare. He had lost everything, his humanity, his freedom, but he had never lost his will to fight. The core hummed louder, and Mira's fingers flew over the controls. "Come on," she muttered, "just a little more." Suddenly, the console screen went dark. A voice echoed through the chamber, cold and mocking. You've come far, Dr. Ilan, the voice said, but this is as far as you go. Mira's blood ran cold. She recognized that voice. Voss. Facing Voss. The air was thick with tension as Mira stood frozen in the center of the control room. The lights above flickered, casting long, erratic shadows across the walls, and the hum of machinery filled the space. The cold voice of Captain Voss echoed through the speakers again, sending a chill down her spine. You've done well to get this far, Dr. Ilan, Voss's voice sneered. But you're too late. This is where it all ends. Mira's heart raced as her hands shook, hovering over the console. She had been so close to shutting down the Lazarus core, but now the entire facility felt like it was closing in on her. She glanced over her shoulder, as though expecting the walls to close in on her, but there was nothing. Only the faint glow from the machines that seemed to pulse with malevolent life. Then a low rumble reverberated through the floor, and Mira's breath caught in her throat. The facility was shifting, reconfiguring itself. She could feel the change in the air. Something powerful, something dangerous. You're not going to make it out of here, Voss's voice continued, his tone smug. Your soldier's little rampage is almost over, and once he's gone, so are you. Mira's gaze snapped to the door at the far end of the room, where she could hear the sounds of heavy footsteps. She knew Voss was no longer just speaking through the intercom. He was close, very close. With one final, desperate motion, Mira slammed her palm against the console, triggering the emergency lockdown. But before the system could activate, a flash of light illuminated the room. Mira spun around, her heart racing, and saw him. Captain Voss stood in the doorway, a towering figure dressed in dark combat armor. His face was shadowed, but Mira could see the cruel smirk playing at the edge of his lips. His cold eyes locked onto hers with unshakable certainty. You don't understand, do you, Doctor? Voss said, his voice dripping with disdain. You think you've won, but you're just a cog in a much larger machine. Lazarus was never about soldiers. It was about control. And now, your little pet project is the key. Mira's pulse quickened. Voss wasn't just interested in controlling soldiers. He was after something far more dangerous, total domination. She glanced over at the Lazarus core, its pulsing glow intensifying, as if responding to Voss's words. You're wrong, Mira said, her voice steadier than she felt. You think you're in control, but you've created a monster. Jared isn't your weapon anymore. Voss laughed, a dark, bitter sound. He was always mine, the perfect soldier with the perfect heart. You think you can just undo what we've done. You have no idea what you're dealing with. Mira took a step forward, her mind racing. She had to stall them, buy more time for Jared to get to her. The seconds were ticking away like a bomb waiting to go off. Your heart, she said, isn't the weapon you think it is. It's unstable. If you activate it too much, it will destroy everything you've worked for. Voss's smile faltered for the first time. He didn't speak for a moment, but his cold eyes narrowed, studying her. You think I don't know that? He said slowly, his voice turning darker. I spent years perfecting this technology. Jared's heart is a beacon, a conduit. It's the power I need to control everything. Mira's mind raced. Voss's obsession with Jared's heart wasn't just about creating an army. It was about absolute control, a way to manipulate entire populations. She could already see the chaos it would unleash if Voss succeeded. And then, as if on cue, Mira's comms device buzzed in her ear. Mira, are you there? Jared's voice crackled, weak but determined. I'm on my way. Get ready. Mira's heart surged with a mix of hope and fear. Jared was still alive, still fighting, but he was running out of time. His power was fading. She could feel it, even through the comms. The toll of what he had unleashed was wearing him down. We don't have much time, Mira said, her voice urgent, but calm. Jared's coming, but you have to listen to me, Voss. If you want to take control, fine, but you're not walking out of here. Voss took a step forward, his hands moving to the sides of his armor, revealing the control panel embedded into his suit. I don't need to walk out of here, Doctor. I just need to make sure you and your little soldier don't make it out. This is the final stage of Project Lazarus, and this time you won't be able to stop it. He pressed a button on the control panel, and the Lazarus core glowed brighter, pulsing with intense energy. Mira's stomach dropped. The core was being activated. No, she shouted, rushing toward the console, but it was too late. The machine whirred to life, and a low guttural hum filled the room. The very walls seemed to vibrate as energy surged through the facility. Mira could feel it, the power of the core rushing toward the surface, threatening to consume everything. Voss stepped back, watching the chaos unfold. This is the end of your experiment, Doctor, and the beginning of a new world order. Suddenly, a massive explosion shook the facility, rattling the walls. Mira stumbled, her vision blurry as she tried to keep her balance. From the doorway, Jared appeared, his chest glowing brighter than ever. But his movements were staggered, and his face was pale. He was barely holding it together. I've had enough of your plan, Voss. Jared's voice rang out, raw and defiant. Voss turned, a look of pure rage flashing across his face. You're too late, he spat. This was always going to be my victory. But Jared wasn't listening. His body crackled with energy as he took a step forward, eyes fixed on the Lazarus core. The blue light surrounding his chest flared one last time. I'm ending this now, Jared declared. With that, he lunged forward, his energy coursing through the room like a tidal wave. And the world went black. The final sacrifice. The world seemed to freeze for a split second. The air grew thick with energy, crackling with the intensity of Jared's power. His chest glowed fiercely, brighter than it ever had before. It was as though he was both the weapon and the explosion, a fuse ready to ignite everything in his path. Mira's heart skipped a beat as she watched him, knowing that this would be the final moment of truth. The Lazarus core hummed with an almost malevolent energy, a twisted mirror of the blue light in Jared's chest. The ground shook violently beneath them as the machine whirred to life, feeding off Jared's power, amplifying it. It was no longer just a tool of destruction. It had become a living, breathing thing. And at the center of it all, standing between life and annihilation, was Jared. Stop, Mira shouted, running toward him, her voice desperate. She knew the core was unstable, but so was Jared. He was pushing his limits, his heart thrumming with energy that he could barely contain. Jared turned to her, his eyes burning with determination, but they were filled with pain. The blue glow had begun to flicker, like a candle that was about to be blown out. Sweat streamed down his face as his hands trembled. He wasn't just fighting the machine anymore. He was fighting himself. This has to end, Mira, he said, his voice low and strained. I can't control it anymore. If I don't destroy it now, it'll destroy everything. Mira's breath caught in her throat. She couldn't lose him. Not like this. Jared, please, she cried, her hands reaching for him. There has to be another way. You don't have to do this. Jared took a step back, his body swaying on the edge of collapse. His gaze softened, and for a brief moment, the fire in his eyes dimmed. He reached out, his hand brushing against hers. There was never another way, he whispered, his voice barely audible over the roar of the core. I was always meant to end this. You saved me, Mira, but I can't run from this anymore. I don't have a choice. Mira's heart shattered as she realized what he was saying. She knew, deep down, that Jared's sacrifice was the only way to stop the Lazarus nightmare once and for all. He wasn't just a soldier. He was humanity's last hope, and he was willing to give it all up. Don't, Mira whispered, tears welling up in her eyes. Please, don't leave me. Jared smiled faintly, his hand gripping hers with what little strength he had left. I'll always be with you. In here, he said, tapping his chest, where the blue glow pulsed weakly. With a final, shaky breath, He turned back to the Lazarus core, his eyes locked onto the heart of the machine. He raised his hand, his body trembling under the immense pressure of the energy coursing through him. The blue light in his chest flared one last time, and Mira could feel the heat radiating from him, like a star on the verge of burning out. "Goodbye, Mira," he said, his voice a whisper carried away by the chaos. "Thank you for everything." And then, in one final burst of power, Jared unleashed everything. The energy from his chest surged outward, a wave of pure, unrelenting force that crashed into the Lazarus core. The room seemed to explode around them as the core overloaded, its systems short-circuiting in a deafening scream of metal and electricity. Mira was thrown backward, her body slamming into the wall as the light from Jared's sacrifice consumed everything. When the light finally dimmed and the dust settled, Mira opened her eyes, blinking against the smoke and debris. Her body ached, but she didn't care. Her eyes scanned the ruins of the control room, searching for him. But there was no sign of Jared. The Lazarus core lay in pieces, its power extinguished. But the room felt empty, hollow, like a part of her had been ripped away. Tears streamed down Mira's face as she stood, her knees weak. The battle was over. The nightmare that had haunted them both was finally finished. But the cost had been unimaginable. She stumbled to her feet, her hands shaking as she touched the remains of the Lazarus core. The blue glow had faded, leaving only darkness in its wake. Mira looked up at the sky outside, her heart aching with loss, but filled with a strange sense of peace. Jared had sacrificed himself to end the madness, to stop the cycle of pain, death, and manipulation. He had given everything, not for revenge, but for hope, and that hope would live on. "I won't forget you," Mira whispered, her voice breaking. "You were human. You were a hero." With the remnants of the Lazarus facility crumbling around her, Mira walked out into the cold night, the echoes of Jared's sacrifice haunting her every step. She knew the world was no longer the same. It never could be. But for the first time in years, Mira felt the weight of something lighter in her chest. The legacy of Jared Cross, the soldier who had come back from the dead, the man who had fought for humanity, was not gone. It was in every step she took, in every choice she made, and in every life she would help rebuild. Jared Cross might have died, but he had given humanity the one thing it needed more than anything else: a second chance. The end.